Well, good morning, everybody. We'll give everyone about a minute to come in here. I see a couple hundred folks coming in via YouTube. Good morning to everyone. I hope everyone is safe this morning. And we'll begin our discussion with Chris Franklin here from WWL-TV. So just give everyone a few more minutes or a minute or so to join the chat, and we'll begin.
Good morning.
Well, Chris, let's get started. First, I'll introduce myself. My name is Kyle Whitfield. I'm the digital director at NOLA.com, the Times-Picayune, the Advocate, and the Acadiana Advocate. And I'm pleased to be joined this morning by WWL Chief Meteorologist Chris Franklin. Chris, good morning. I hope you and the team are doing well. I know it's been a 24 hours of work for the past couple of days. So how are you guys doing?
You know, we're fine. I was here for many hurricanes and have spent long hours where you're kind of sleeping on the floor in the television station. If you're lucky enough to get a hotel room where you can get a few hours of sleep just to take a break, it's not bad. You know, I worked a 12-hour shift last night, and I'd rather do that any day of the week than have to deal with being being in the shoes of the meteorologist over in the Lake Charles area,
Sure.
Where you're not only trying to cover this through its duration, but also worrying about your family, your friends, your neighbors, and just worrying about your property. So you've got that on your mind, as well as your job as a meteorologist, trying to inform the public, warn the public, get folks out of harm's way. So, you know, in the grand scheme of things, us being tired over the past week, and it has been kind of an exhausting week, just trying to figure out Marco and then Laura, the 1-2 punch potential, the historic nature of having both of these storms. Luckily, we didn't see the historic nature of a 2 hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico at the same time, both moving into southeast Louisiana. But unfortunately, we had to deal with the historic nature of a Category 4 hurricane. Really, a Category 4 hurricane making landfall in the continental United States is historic in and of itself, but solely based on winds of 150 miles an hour, Laura will go down as tying the last island hurricane in 1856 as the strongest hurricane to make landfall in Louisiana in recorded history. So, you know, when you look and kind of put things into perspective, and I guess my perspective has changed from when I first started as a meteorologist on television 15 years ago to where I am now, with a wife, with a home, with 2 young children. Your perspective kind of changes, and where at one time I might have complained about the long hours, and I might have gotten even kind of excited about a hurricane of this magnitude and of this historic of a nature making landfall. Your perspective changes as you're now a little bit more, I think, responsible and a little more mature with this is going to impact people. And we've all seen it from Katrina. You know, Gustav did a fair number on us. I was there at landfall for Hurricane Michael a couple of years ago in Panama City, and then went over to Mexico Beach. So once you really experience how this impacts people, you kind of change your perspective from being a scientist, either in the field or just sitting in front of a computer analyzing the storm, and you become, for lack of a better, you become more human in the science. You kind of put that more human aspect that maybe some folks that are so enthralled in the science of meteorology sometimes don't consider that these historic storms affect people. And you know, sometimes we almost look more at the textbook examples and the historic nature of it and how this will go down in history compared to all other hurricanes, and the science behind it and what drove the storm, what were the inner dynamics of the storm, why did it intensify so much, what was going on right before landfall, why didn't we see any kind of weakening, and all of those things. And you almost have to then think, all right, I'm so giddy about a Category 4 maybe becoming a Category 5, maybe I should also think about the fact that this is going to dramatically change people's lives in whatever region it makes landfall. And I saw somebody post, and Colin, I don't know if you were here for Katrina, but I remember I was on television in New Orleans, and we all sat down with a psychologist, and she said, you're going to see things now as pre-Katrina and post-Katrina, before and after the storm. And so now for many New Orleanians, we still see it as that, even 15 years removed, and probably will for a long time to come, at least this generation. And now folks in Lake Charles are going to see things as before Laura and after Laura. So I guess the long roundabout answer of how we're doing, we're fine.
Yeah, there's certainly, it's a great way to frame it, Chris. You know, you think about the intersection of science and empathy, right?
And it is a fine line.
But I think that's why it's important, before we get into the science here in a moment, I think it's important for us to say, you know, as local news organizations, I think we balance the science and the empathy. It's really important to us because these are our communities. I mean, this is, you know, who's not been to Lake Charles, who doesn't know folks in Lake Charles, colleagues at the American Press and KPLC and those media outlets there, and those families and those folks there, as we'll see in a minute here on the satellite photographs here. I mean, Chris, we're still talking about a Category 1 hurricane this morning in North Louisiana. I mean, that's unfathomable. I'll show some pictures here as we transition through the presentation that show really, not sure if everyone's seen these, but first let's look at the winds before we look at the photos. And Chris, I mean, put these wind gusts into perspective.
You know, these type of winds measured, first off, it's incredible that we had the instruments that were able to measure these type of wind speeds. Sometimes you start to get in excess of 100 miles an hour, and the anemometer, which is what measures wind speed and direction, is destroyed. So first off, it's incredible that the instruments lasted as long as they did to even measure these type of winds. Now, these are wind gusts, so it does, these are not the sustained winds, but certainly wind gusts like these are what you would experience in an EF1 tornado. And that is going to do some significant, if not catastrophic damage. And that's just wind alone. We're not talking about the rainfall and the surge, which luckily, and I know Kyle will talk about this a bit, the surge wasn't as bad as it was forecasted. But those winds, when you are near and a landfall in Category 4 with winds of 150 miles an hour moving directly over a highly populated area, you're going to see massive, widespread damage, as just these few pictures. And you know, we're going to continue to see countless more pictures and video through the day. I mean, we're really just getting day one started of landfall. Landfall was at about 1 a.m. I shared a graphic last night on social media of the moment when the Lake Charles radar went offline. And it was very eerily reminiscent of watching the radar out of Slidell during Katrina, as the center of Katrina began moving up toward the southeast Louisiana, South Mississippi coast, and you get that eye moving over land, and then all of a sudden that radar image stops. It freezes because the radar has gone dead. And we saw that at about 1 a.m. Last night at Lake Charles, which is about the time that they were experiencing the northern eye wall, which the northern and then eastern eye wall are the worst parts of the storm, and that moved directly over Lake Charles. It could have been a little bit more west. Again, the precise landfall of a exact town or precise latitude and longitude of where it's going to make landfall is next to impossible. We can give you a fairly rough idea, and that rough idea had always been, for the last several days, the models and the forecast have been very consistent on the Texas-Louisiana line, and for all intents and purposes, that is where it made landfall. Of course, the center was a little bit more east of that, which then placed some of the strongest winds directly over Lake Charles. So you saw some of those wind gusts that will do damage just like you're seeing.
Yeah, and these are some of the photos we show here from the Associated Press taken this morning. And Chris, this is structural damage that is just hard to put into words. I mean, this was not a tornado, but a tornado-like event in terms of a wind event. I mean, look at this structure here in downtown Lake Charles. We're talking about the top of a building, you know, crumbled bricks on the ground. I mean, I'll go back to this photograph here for those who have visited Lake Charles. This is the Capital One tower downtown, and those are windows blown out right in that area. I mean, it's really shocking to see.
And again, reminiscent of what some of the buildings downtown New Orleans look like with the windows blown out from Katrina. Very,
Or the Hyatt.
very similar. And you consider Katrina was a weaker storm when it hit us. Now you can't take each storm, and I hate to even say that, because you cannot compare storm to storm, because each and every hurricane, tropical storm are completely different. The big comparison with this was Rita, just at least in recent memory, and the similarity in the track. Well, for one thing, Rita was a 5 and weakened to a 3 at landfall. Now, it still had, kind of like Katrina, Category 5 surge, which is why we saw such excessive surge in Southwest Louisiana from Rita, whereas Laura was a strengthening 4. At 10 a.m., let's see, today's Thursday. At 10 a.m. on Tuesday, Laura had just become a hurricane. 24 hours later, 10 a.m. Wednesday, it was on the route of becoming a major hurricane. So it didn't actually maintain that major status for a very long period of time, whereas Rita was already a 5 once it got into the Southern Gulf. Katrina was a 5 for a while in the Southern Gulf. So the surge, the impacts were far worse from those storms. And not to downplay the impacts that we have seen in Southwest Louisiana by any means, but just to try to give some understanding of, when I know we'll talk, why wasn't the surge quite as big? And some may even say, well, I would have expected more damage than that. Well, believe me, that is substantial damage, and we're going to see a lot more pictures coming out through the course of the day today. But it's just that it's everybody wants to compare storm to storm. Well, I wrote out X, so I'll be fine during Y. That isn't a very good rule of thumb to live by with these storms.
Right, exactly. You should always heed what your local officials are telling you. I mean, the fact of the matter is they know what their rescue capabilities are during a major storm, and that's that's a very important piece. Chris, let's bring it a little bit to where we are now. This is a radar picture showing North Louisiana. The storm, as of this morning, like you said, is a Category 1 in North Louisiana. Let's look at the radar, though, regionally. And could you explain and break down sort of perhaps the track of Laura now, and why actually today for the New Orleans and Metro Baton Rouge areas might be a little more perilous in terms of impacts today rather than maybe last night?
Yeah, and we're not talking about the rainfall totals that we have seen out in Lake Charles, but what's happening now, and when the storm was making landfall, let's start there. It was a tightly wound, compact storm, and what was fascinating was you really could see the bulk of the rain associated with Laura, really from the Texas-Louisiana state line to roughly west of Morgan City. So kind of looking at the map here, it really was just across the rainfall of Laura, the Texas-Louisiana line, so kind of from between Beaumont and Lake Charles to a little bit west, or excuse me, a little bit east of Vermilion Bay. That was it. At 2 o'clock when I left work last night, there was still no rainfall around Southeast Louisiana. We had seen all of the rain compact right around the center. Now what we're starting to see is, as the storm is weakening, we're beginning to see that rainfall kind of spread out a bit. And one of the feeder bands that, again, even though the circulation is well inland now, almost north of Alexandria, it is still drawing moisture out of the Gulf of Mexico. So now we find, as a lot of the rain is spreading out away from the center, we are finding ourselves still on the eastern side, but we're under now all of that moisture being drawn out of the Gulf. That's going to persist today as well as into Friday. Now, hopefully what we see is, and we're starting to kind of see that just on the few images of radar here, that the bands that are setting up are moving slightly kind of from west to east. What we don't want to see is a band set up and they're kind of along a parallel of north to south. That's where you would get the training of rain, where one of these bands sets up and it just keeps dumping rain over and over the same swath. So what we'll likely see is certain swaths of areas across Louisiana, Southeast Louisiana, that have more substantial amounts of rainfall, maybe in excess of 4 to 6 inches. And then perhaps a few miles away, there's a far drier swath. It just depends on where those bands set up today that would lead to some flooding concerns. Again, in the grand scheme of things, the impacts to Southeast Louisiana, even today, are minimal. We are likely to see some localized flooding. Hopefully, we don't see any of those set up right over the city or in areas that are more prone to flooding. It's a little bit harder to get just natural drainage to clear that water out. And we've seen, I mean, how many times in just the last few years have we been preparing for a tropical landfall? Barry comes to mind. Cristobal comes to mind, especially Barry. We were preparing for a tropical storm, and days before had a flooding rain from just an afternoon thunderstorm. So it doesn't take much to flood certain parts of New Orleans, especially, but other parts of Southeast Louisiana. So it's just really the big question mark of where some of those bands set up. But we'll keep our rainfall. You can kind of see on this wider radar how far out into the Gulf this feeder band is. I mean, it goes from basically the coast of Texas, well south of Galveston, south of Corpus Christi, and then feeds all the way into Southeast Louisiana. So there is what we call a, excuse me, what we call a fetch of moisture, basically that moisture that is running all along the Gulf of Mexico into Louisiana. So there is a long fetch of that tropical moisture that'll keep us on the wet side during the day. But what we also see is on radar that this isn't just a big rain shield where it's just a constant rain. It does look like we get breaks in the rainfall. So that does help us out. If we get a heavy downpour and then get enough of a break to where drainage can kind of catch up, then we should be okay. One other thing that should keep us okay is the fact that we've been rather dry for the last several days. Our rainfall has been pretty minimal for the last several days. So the ground is dry. It can absorb a lot of this just ground, the soil drawing that moisture deeper in will also help prevent widespread flooding. And this never really looked like it was going to be a widespread flooding issue for us, but certainly some localized flooding will be a concern today and something that we'll have to watch. Not only that, you see those little pink boxes that are popping up on the North Shore. Those are tornado warnings, and we had several of them yesterday, and we'll see some during the day today. Maybe not quite as many as we saw yesterday, but just the nature of a tropical storm, a hurricane making landfall, just the overall circulation around the storm lends itself to see some brief spin-ups within those bands, and it can produce a usually short-lived weak tornado, but a weak tornado is still going to be capable of doing some damage.
Yeah, and maybe one thing that we're sort of happy about with the storm, and that sounds weird to say happy about, but it's moving. It's moving quickly.
It is. It is moving. It did not sit. So it wasn't dumping those historical rainfall amounts that we have seen in the Houston and Beaumont area in the last several years. So yeah, that luckily, again, I guess you're kind of like me, you're ever the optimist. You try and find what little silver lining we can. And, and that's one thing. I was trying to find some silver lining with 150-mile-an-hour winds. Well, my silver lining was at least it hasn't strengthened. And then today, at least it's moving. You try and find some kind of, you can't avoid these storms. You can get out of its way, but it's coming. So you just try and find some little piece of good news that you can.
Certainly, and we'll take a look at the track here as we see what's going on in the next couple of days. It will continue to move north and then east of us. And Chris, if we had our pick, not only would we not have picked this storm to come here, we would not have picked it to go east as it went north, because that keeps that moisture flow correct from creates that banding effect over us. So
so we'll still see rain associated with Laura into Friday, and then by Saturday, Sunday, it will no longer be an issue for us. We may still see some of the almost remnant energy sitting over us a bit, and call it energy. That may keep our rain chances around 50-60% this weekend, but no, certainly not the flooding rains. And something that we don't talk about in coastal areas is the inland flooding. And I'm not talking about inland like the North Shore or even South Mississippi. I'm talking about as these storms still producing copious amounts of rainfall can create major hazards for more highland areas and more mountainous terrains. And these luckily it will be moving, but believe me, there will likely be some flooding rains looking at the track, across Kentucky, across the Virginias, into the Appalachians. before it finally moves out. Now, again, luckily, as you see how far it'll go between 7 a.m. Saturday around West Virginia, Kentucky line to just about off the East Coast by later that evening. So it is moving. So hopefully the inland flooding isn't a major player to this in terms of all the eventual impacts that we're going to see listed from Laura. But that is also a major concern for areas that are nowhere close to the Gulf of Mexico or Atlantic Ocean. The inland flooding can also be a deadly impact from these storms. And luckily, that should not be the case, as this will be a pretty quick moving storm. It's going to get caught up in the mid-latitude westerlies, which is why you see that almost rapid motion of the remnants moving out in the Atlantic.
Yeah, and even notice, look at 7 a.m. Sunday, re-strengthening almost into a tropical storm before it becomes becoming extra tropical. So, Laura's definitely had a long path. And the last topic, Chris, I want to go into is about the surge. The storm surge, when it came out from the National Hurricane Center and the National Weather Service and those other agencies, it was a worst case storm surge scenario. Looking at the path that Laura took onshore, could you explain a little bit about how that track, the actual track, not the projected track, perhaps played a role in, thankfully, not reaching that worst case storm surge scenario?
Yeah, it's almost what do you want to balance it out with? Do you want the strongest winds in the northern eye wall, or do you want the potential massive storm surge? And Lake Charles, I guess, voted for the incredible winds. As the storm moved right over Lake Charles, and you see this is probably around 1 a.m. That radar image, I would guess, only because that was when the northern eye wall, worst part of the storm really, moved directly over Lake Charles. So that's where your strongest winds were. But because of that, if you kind of take the eastern eye wall and stretch it out maybe about 30 or so miles from the center, that's where you're going to get the highest surge. Luckily, it wasn't nearly as bad as was anticipated. As you mentioned, it was the worst case scenario forecast of surge, and some were calling for Cameron and Vermilion to see a 15 to 20. So far from a lot of the gauges I looked at around that, it seems as though it got up to about 11, maybe near 12 feet. So it wasn't nearly as bad. But again, I think a lot of that can be attributed to the fact that it did, yes, become a major hurricane, but it was not a major hurricane for a very long period of time. So it didn't really have a whole lot of time to draw that ocean Gulf height higher that would send a far higher surge than what we actually observed. Storm surge forecasting is very, very, very difficult. In the terms of the complexity of tropical forecasting, I would put storm surge on impact as probably the greatest in terms of the uncertainty and inaccuracy. We really are just taking kind of rough estimates. We look at models. I'm sure a lot of folks have heard of the slosh model for storm surge forecasting. That kind of gives you a broad idea. We also base surge forecasts on what past storms have done. And even as I've said, I don't like comparing storms. That's what you sometimes have to do to at least try and get a rough idea of what the surge could be. And obviously we did not see 15, but some areas were close to that. And so we were kind of a few feet away from the low end of that initial high range. So the greatest range that I ever saw forecasted from surge was about 15 to 20 feet. Obviously, we didn't get to 15 feet, but we certainly got very, very close. And had this storm actually made landfall around the Texas-Louisiana line, so a little bit more west of Lake Charles, then we would have seen a greater surge coming into Cameron Parish and coming up some of those bays and lakes and right toward Lake Charles. And luckily, that was not the case. So storm surge is very difficult to forecast because it also all rides on the precise landfall location of a hurricane, and that is very, very difficult to forecast. Again, like I said, we can give you a rough maybe 20-mile radius, maybe even a little bit tighter than that, of where it will make landfall, but that little 15 to 20-mile radius makes a huge difference in who actually would see some of the worst of the storm surge. And storm surge is not created equal. I actually use the example, the way the coastline, the sea surface builds up to the coastline in southeast Louisiana is a very sharp increase. When you go off the coast, anybody that does any fishing, you reach deep water very, very quickly off the mouth of the river. In Miami, it's a very shallow, gradual increase of the sea floor up to the coast. Well, if you took the exact same storm and you put them moving at the exact same path, say southeast to northwest toward the mouth of the river and toward Miami, the storm surge would be a lot lower in Miami than it would be in New Orleans, because that sharp increase in the seafloor actually lends itself to a higher storm surge than that gradual increase that you see off the coast of Miami. So when you're forecasting storm surge, you're not only considering the size of the storm, you're also having to then consider what coastline it's reaching, and something that needs to be entered into computer models. And to not get too much into the details about that, a computer model needs to know exactly how everything is. It needs to, what we say, initialize correctly. It needs to know precisely what the atmosphere is in a hurricane, and it needs to know precisely what your coastline looks like. If you've ever been to the Louisiana coastline, you know it constantly changes. Did an interview with LSU that run one of those storm surge models, and they said one of the most difficult parts of storm surge forecasting for especially the southeast Louisiana coast is we really don't have a clear picture of what is our coast, what's Gulf, what's marsh, what's land, what's more the just kind of murky, marshier areas. So if we don't really have a clear picture of what our coastline even looks like, that right there is going to give us somewhat incorrect data in the computer models to forecast now a storm surge. So luckily, it wasn't as bad as it could have. I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that, one, the placement of where the storm actually made landfall, and two, the fact that it was not a Category 4 storm for a very long period of time. As I mentioned, it became a hurricane at 10 a.m. on Tuesday, 10 a.m. Wednesday. It was already on the doorstep of being a major hurricane. So, and then made landfall less than 12 hours after that. So, or just more than 12 hours after that. So that window of actually being a major hurricane, I don't think it gave it enough time for that surge to quite reach the peaks that it could easily have done.
Yeah, and Chris, I think it's important to point out that the National Hurricane Center and the local meteorologists, including the folks at WWL-TV, I mean, this track was nailed for several days. I mean, we knew several days out that this storm would make landfall somewhere around the Texas-Louisiana state lines, and look where it came across. I mean, that is precise, and it's very important that that's that way it is, because it gives people time to leave. So we can,
right,
perhaps as scientists and meteorologists and reporters, we're not quite there on the surge forecast being as precise or the intensity forecast being as precise, but getting that track is so very important for public safety. And
that's one of the Hurricane Center, the folks there are the experts in this field, and they willingly admit in even a lot of their discussions that the forecast for the track is far more accurate than their intensity forecast. And they're not ones, even if you start, and the problem with social media is you start seeing, well, this scientist showed us this one model and he has it exploding in strength. And okay, well, that one model showed that, but 5 of the other accurate tropical models are not showing that. So, well, that model turned out to be correct. Okay, well, that worked out well for this storm. But at the time, how are we to know that that one model was the one that would end up being the correct forecast? We just don't know. And that's when you start to use not only your education, but kind of your experience, and you start to say, okay, well, if this model, and some of them, well, it blows up every single storm. So you kind of take that with a grain of salt. And this model doesn't develop anything. So you kind of take that with a grain of salt, and you just really use your judgment as a meteorologist. You use your experience in certain areas. You use your experience with tracking tropical systems as to, okay, this looks eerily similar to what we saw from X storm. And again, I keep emphasizing, I don't like comparing storms, but when I do compare storms, I don't like to do it, but sometimes you have to, at least to give you a rough idea as kind of a starting point. And so you just kind of use that experience as to what this storm could do And then there always is that as the more communication side of the science of meteorology. Look, it's easy to sit in front of a computer and post pictures to, now that everybody has a Twitter account, and post pictures on Twitter of all of these computer models. Well, a lot of those guys aren't answering to the public. You can post whatever you want. I mean, anybody is free to post whatever they like, but they're not answerable to bosses and management and a corporate owner and the public. And I mean, in all honesty, I obviously have to answer to my bosses, but I also hold a greater responsibility to the public that I'm trying to inform. So I'm not going to see one computer model. Oh, that one explodes, Laura, and send. I'm going to be a little bit more hesitant and watch to see how things evolve, because and a lot of the tropical experts that I do follow and have a great deal of respect for, if you kind of look back at their posts, their range goes from it's going to explode to this. Well, now we're starting to see a trend like this, so it may be a little bit on the weaker side. Well, now it looks like it's going to be this. That is very confusing for the public. You need to have at least one, baseline forecast that you're providing. You do at least try and vocalize the uncertainty in the forecasts, but you don't want to just keep posting random tweets and images of a monster storm. Here it is weakening. Wait, here it could be a monster. It's going to be over here. Now it's going to be over here. That's just very confusing. And I mentioned this on the radio, even as a meteorologist, having been in the broadcast field now for 15 years, I'll follow these experts on Twitter, and it'll get me overwhelmed that, okay, I need to just take a break and use my own forecasting. And sometimes those are the more relaxing of my days, when I don't look at what the others are saying. And I'm talking others. There's no surprise, I shouldn't think, that scientists collaborate. Science is a collaborative field. We do consult with others. And not to put myself in the field of a medical doctor by any means, but I've always kind of considered the television meteorologist, those of us that went to school for meteorology, as more of a general practitioner doctor. We have to know a little bit about everything from tropical weather to snow. I was in Kansas for my first job, but I went to college on the Gulf Coast. Cold fronts. You have to know a little bit about geology. You have to know a little bit about astronomy. They want you to talk about meteor showers and comets. So we kind of consider ourselves the general practitioner, but then we also look to experts that specialize. So we look to the specialists. We look to those scientists that their sole mission was tropical meteorology. Their sole mission was winter weather. Their sole focus is severe weather. So we kind of consult with them to see, okay, well, what are they? Here's what I think from my experience and my knowledge, but someone that they literally are looking at radar and satellite passes and analyzing a storm that, just to be honest, I don't have time to do. We can't do that kind of in-depth analysis that could take hours to do. We just don't have the time. So we look to those folks that we respect and, okay, so what are you thinking? Where are you kind of breaking down some of the more in the weeds type details of these storms? So, some folks, oh, well, you just get it from the Weather Service. Well, I read what the Weather Service says. I want to hear what those meteorologists say. I want to read what the National Hurricane Center says. But I'm also a meteorologist that studied this in college, and I make my own forecast. So before I even look at what the Hurricane Center or the Weather Service office has said, I make my own forecast. And then if I kind of see what they're saying, I'll maybe adjust mine. Or if I'm not in total agreement, and there's nothing wrong with not agreeing, and science is not precise, especially weather. This is a very inexact science. And sometimes it is just kind of the opinion of the meteorologist when making our forecast, which is why if you watch me and even just within our own channel, sometimes our 7-day forecast may change or be slightly differently, because we all four are making our own forecast. We are all using our education and experience to build our own forecast. We're not making one forecast and everybody has to use this one. No, it's kind of up to that meteorologist as to, hey, I'm seeing this as the reason why our temperature will be 90. Well, I'm seeing this as to why our temperature may be 86 degrees. Okay, we both have a fair argument, and you use your forecast. And that's kind of why there is no standard forecast that you see across the board for New Orleans, because we're all using our own knowledge and experience to build these forecasts. But that also makes it a little bit kind of frustrating for viewers when it can lend itself to maybe a bit of confusion that we're not trying to do. We're trying to make this as understandable and as concise as we possibly can.
Sure, and I think it's important to end with to talk basically the steady hand, the forecasting steady hand by the folks at WWL, the reporters and editors at the Times-Picayune and the Advocate, and the folks at the National Hurricane Center. The steady hand in the forecast of this major storm helped save lives. I mean, it did.
I hope so, and that's the one solace we can get from our job, and sometimes we annoy people when we cut into programming and annoy people when we do have to keep changing. Well, you were saying Southeast, now you're saying Southwest Louisiana. Well, it's just, that's how we see things at that time. And that's what we base our forecast on. That's how things are shaping up right now. And of course, it can always change. And really, more than any aspect of forecasting, the tropics are one of the most difficult. And I know that does give anxiety and frustration to viewers, because it is never a set in stone forecast. And as we even saw from Marco, the forecast was still very much uncertain when it was sitting off of the Louisiana coast as a Category 1. We certainly thought, and it looked as though it was going to be weakening as it made landfall. I don't think we totally foresaw the fact that we would have this weak little spin near the mouth of the river, and all of the thunderstorms actually parked over Panama City. We may not have seen quite that extreme of a ripping apart of the storm, but something we had kept emphasizing is that this isn't going to be a strong storm. It is going to be weakening, and we should see, rather minimal impacts from Marco. And we did. It was actually maybe a bit more exaggerated than even what we first thought, but it just really shows you how inconsistent, well, not inconsistent, how very much an unknown and very still much a mystery in these forecasts. And just one other thing I want to say before because I can drone on, as you can clearly see. That's why the producers love me during hurricane coverage, because they can start me up and let me go for about a half hour, and they don't even need to fill time with anything else. But I will say what's very interesting, and some of the anxiety leads to folks want to know, when these are invests, where it's going to go. Well, just in my 15 years of broadcasting, there was a time when I started where we didn't talk publicly about an area of investigation. We didn't talk about spaghetti plots. Both of those were more internal products that we used for just our initial forecasting of, okay, well, this may be something we have to look at next week as a potential tropical threat in the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, I'm going to keep that in the back of my mind. Probably won't mention that on air because it's so far out. Well, now you can see that on social media. So when the public sees it, we find the responsibility of, okay, well, now I have to address it. So now we're tracking invests. Now we're tracking thunderstorms that are sitting over sub-Saharan Africa, and people want to know, where's it going to go and what's it going to do? I don't know. It is so far out. And I still remember some of those giddier meteorologists as we were tracking invest. I think Laura and Marco started out as invest 97 and 98. But boy, look at this big cluster of thunderstorms that are going to be coming off of Africa. That's going to be the next one to watch. And you know what happened to that? Nada. It didn't do anything. I don't track systems that are still sitting over sub-Saharan Africa. I tend to even not play a big focus when you just have that yellow X and a highlighted area of maybe where we could see some development, when they're so far out, and you would have literally 2 weeks to prepare for something that developed that far into the Atlantic. I tend not to get people too anxious and worried about something that possibly will never even materialize, and also very likely will never come to Southeast Louisiana.
Sure. Well, Chris, I'm grateful for your time this morning, and also I have to thank you guys, and Alexandra and Peyton and Dave. You guys do a fantastic job there. Again, thank you for your steady hand in your broadcasting and your forecasting, your meteorology. Thank you for explaining some of the science to us today.
I
And
hope I didn't drone on too much. I don't know what point viewers started saying, "Yeah, he's rambling again."
they're still here. They love you, Chris. So, but
Well,
very
I don't
appreciative.
know if it's me or they were hoping that they would get a chance to yell at me for cutting off Big Brother last night.
There you go.
Sorry about that.
Very appreciative of the time, and you guys take care, and we'll talk soon.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.